And just as my mother-in-law was about to retrieve the Tupperware from the cupboard, my father-in-law suddenly collapsed, falling out of his chair. Everyone's attention turned to him as he clutched his stomach in obvious pain. We were all taken aback by this unexpected turn of events. "What's wrong with you?" my mother-in-law exclaimed, clearly concerned for her husband. In response, my father-in-law uttered something that surprised me. "I just ate some food from the kitchen. Why is my stomach upset all of a sudden?" My mother-in-law's comment didn't escape my notice. "My name is Victoria, and I'm a 20-year-old housewife. I married my husband Adrian last year, and we're the same age. We share similar values and get along exceptionally well. Our love remains as strong as it was when we first started dating. However, there was one issue that had bothered me since our wedding. When we went to my mother-in-law's house to exchange vows, I realized that she held somewhat old-fashioned beliefs. "You'll come to live with us after getting married, won't you?" my mother-in-law had asked, as if it were a given. My husband and I were taken aback. We had no intention of living with my in-laws, so my husband firmly responded, "No, we plan to start our married life on our own." My mother-in-law seemed taken aback by our refusal. "Why? You're the eldest son," she protested. My husband and I exchanged worried glances. However, my father-in-law intervened, saying, "That's an outdated way of thinking. Burton and Victoria should do what they want." His words seemed to calm my mother-in-law down temporarily. Yet there was another issue that continued to loom, adding to the tense atmosphere. Neither my husband nor I had ever planned to have and just as my mother-in-law was about to retrieve the Tupperware from the cupboard, my father-in-law suddenly collapsed, falling out of his chair. Everyone's attention turned to him as he clutched his stomach in obvious pain. We were all taken aback by this unexpected turn of events. "What's wrong with you?" my mother-in-law exclaimed, clearly concerned for her husband. In response, my father-in-law uttered something that surprised me. "I just ate some food from the kitchen. Why is my stomach upset all of a sudden?" My mother-in-law's comment didn't escape my notice. "My name is Victoria, and I'm a 20-year-old housewife. I married my husband Adrian last year, and we're the same age. We share similar values and get along exceptionally well. Our love remains as strong as it was when we first started dating. However, there was one issue that had bothered me since our wedding. When we went to my mother-in-law's house to exchange vows, I realized that she held somewhat old-fashioned beliefs. "You'll come to live with us after getting married, won't you?" my mother-in-law had asked, as if it were a given. My husband and I were taken aback. We had no intention of living with my in-laws, so my husband firmly responded, "No, we plan to start our married life on our own." My mother-in-law seemed taken aback by our refusal. "Why? You're the eldest son," she protested. My husband and I exchanged worried glances. However, my father-in-law intervened, saying, "That's an outdated way of thinking. Burton and Victoria should do what they want." His words seemed to calm my mother-in-law down temporarily. Yet there was another issue that continued to loom, adding to the tense atmosphere. Neither my husband nor I had ever planned to have a wedding ceremony. I prefer simplicity and didn't want anything too extravagant. Instead of a wedding ceremony, my husband and I discussed using the money for travel and other experiences. When I mentioned this to my in-laws, my mother-in-law's face turned the shade of green once again. She was deeply opposed to the idea of skipping the wedding. As I mentioned earlier, my mother-in-law held traditional views and strongly believed in the importance of a wedding ceremony. She couldn't fathom the idea of her eldest son not having one. Her beliefs were deeply rooted, and she disapproved of anything that didn't align with them. Fortunately, my father-in-law came to our rescue once more. He reassured us, saying, "Relatives don't really care about the wedding. They mostly see it as an opportunity to enjoy a good meal. Over time, they'll forget whether there was a wedding or not. So if you two decide not to have a wedding, that's perfectly fine." My father-in-law's kindness and understanding allowed us to stick to our decision and spared us from succumbing to my mother-in-law's traditional expectations. While my mother-in-law wasn't thrilled about it, we proceeded with our wedding without a ceremony and began our... The food is absolutely delicious, and we appreciate all these wonderful dishes. My mother-in-law beamed with happiness upon receiving our praise and encouraged us to eat heartily. We had a delightful evening. However, that night I unexpectedly experienced severe stomach pain. As I sat in the bathroom, a sudden wave of faintness and weakness washed over me. My husband's concerned voice faded into the distance. When I regained consciousness, I found myself lying in a hospital bed. Apparently, my husband had called for an ambulance and I had been rushed to the hospital. The doctors were perplexed and couldn't identify the cause. They ruled out food poisoning or any clear-cut explanation. I couldn't help but wonder if the olive oil and the pasta I had for lunch might have been the culprit, but it remained a mere speculation. They administered an IV drip and allowed me to rest, which eventually improved my condition. My husband and I returned home, and I couldn't shake the feeling of confusion and unease. The incident was a perplexing mystery. 2 months later, the same ordeal repeated itself. Suddenly, I fell ill once again. The only common factor between these episodes was that they occurred after consuming my mother-in-law's cooking at my in-law's house. I couldn't help but question whether there was something wrong with her food. Strangely, my husband, who had eaten the same meals, remained perfectly healthy. A month later, yet another episode occurred following a meal at my in-law's house. In an attempt to unravel this perplexing issue, I invited a friend over for lunch to discuss the situation. She suggested that it might be stress, which made me a bit uneasy. Moreover, given that I consistently fell ill after visiting my in-laws, my husband grew concerned as well. He suggested that we should refrain from going to my in-laws' house for a while, convinced that there was some connection between my mother-in-law's cooking and my recurrent illness. I pondered over that possibility. Following this, my mother-in-law continued to reach out, inviting us for dinner several times. My husband, always considerate of my condition, declined the invitations. However, we received another invitation to a dinner party that we couldn't easily refuse. This time, my brother-in-law and his wife were visiting my parents-in-law's house to celebrate their wedding. I felt a bit down as I had been enjoying better health by avoiding my in-laws' house lately. My husband reassured me, suggesting that I shouldn't feel obligated to eat too much during the gathering. I decided to follow his advice and limit my intake. The day of the party arrived, and my mother-in-law continued to treat me kindly. As long as we engaged in normal conversation, I didn't experience any discomfort. It crossed my mind that there might be an issue with the food itself. Soon, my brother-in-law and his wife arrived, and we engaged in pleasant conversation. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law skillfully prepared the dishes, laying them out beautifully on the table. Her homemade dishes looked appetizing and delectable. In fact, the food had always tasted excellent, and I couldn't understand why I fell ill, no matter how much I contemplated it. Once we were seated at the table, my mother-in-law suggested I try one of the dishes. "Victoria, I remember you mentioning that you like this dish, right? I prepared it exceptionally well today, so please give it a try." I found myself at a loss when my mother-in-law insisted. My husband came to my rescue, explaining that I wasn't feeling well that day and suggesting that I eat sparingly. Nevertheless, my mother-in-law persisted, placing a smaller portion in front of me. While I pondered my response, my brother-in-law came to my rescue. "Victoria, you don't have to force yourself. If you're not feeling well, we've already greeted each other, so if you're unwell, feel free to go home and rest." It seemed my husband had confided in his brother-in-law and sister-in-law about my condition. I could sense that my brother-in-law and his wife, who were aware of the situation, were trying to help me. My mother-in-law must have realized she couldn't insist I eat her food. So she suggested, "Well, if that's the case, I'll pack it in Tupperware for you to take home." I wondered why she was so insistent, but I figured that if I took the food home, I could avoid eating it altogether. I responded, "Thank you, that would be great." Just as my mother-in-law went to fetch the Tupperware, an unexpected event unfolded. My father-in-law suddenly collapsed, falling out of his chair. We all turned our attention to him as he clutched his stomach in apparent distress. It was puzzling as he hadn't even touched the food on the table. A sense of panic swept through the room, and my husband quickly dialed for an ambulance. My mother-in-law accompanied my father-in-law to the hospital. We were left stunned at her house, pondering the strange turn of events. However, I couldn't help but recall my mother-in-law's earlier comment. Evidently, my brother-in-law's wife had overheard it as well. We suspected there might be something unusual in the kitchen. As we ventured into the kitchen, where my mother-in-law had been preparing the meal, we made a startling discovery. We rushed to the hospital where my father-in-law had been admitted. As we passed the hospital's reception desk and entered his room, we overheard voices in conversation. The doctor was inquiring if my mother-in-law had any insight into my father-in-law's condition, to which she replied that she was unaware. Upon entering the room, my mother-in-law appeared uneasy but greeted us, saying, "Oh, you've all come here. Well, that's all right with me. Here, everything will be fine." However, we were determined not to miss this opportunity. I insisted that I needed to speak with her and approached my mother-in-law with my husband, brother-in-law, and his wife following closely. I confronted her with a direct question, asking, "What on earth is going on?" My father-in-law's condition had somewhat stabilized and his complexion had returned to normal, but the doctors were still unsure of the cause. Apparently, he had been conscious for a brief period after arriving at the hospital. However, after multiple visits to the bathroom, he became severely dehydrated and eventually lost consciousness. I locked eyes with my mother-in-law and took something out of my pocket to show her. She immediately recognized it and grew visibly agitated. Attempting to feign ignorance, she asked, "What is this?" I sternly replied, "This is a laxative." I'm curious why there was such a significant amount of laxative powder in the kitchen. My mother-in-law remained silent. The doctor, meanwhile, interjected, "Based on his symptoms, it appears he ingested a substantial quantity of laxatives. We will conduct further tests shortly. Additionally, if laxatives are detected in his system, we will need to inquire when he took them. If he cannot recall the timing, it may suggest that someone intentionally administered them to him. It would indeed be an assault charge." This remark caused my mother-in-law to suddenly panic. She protested, "No, it's not like that. I didn't intend to force him to eat that food. It was mere negligence." My husband reacted to her words, pressing, "Then who are you trying to feed?" My mother-in-law hesitated and then fell silent. Frustrated, my husband warned, "If you won't tell us, we'll have to involve the police in the investigation." Realizing the seriousness of the situation, my mother-in-law relented, saying, "All right, I understand." She proceeded to explain her actions, revealing that it was all directed at me. She intended to punish me by secretly adding laxatives to my food. Confused and hurt, I asked, "Punish me? What have I done to you?" She replied with resentment, "Because my son married you, he's become a disobedient son. You're the one who made him defy our wishes. That's why you're my enemy." My husband and I were shocked by this unfounded resentment, and we exchanged glances. I questioned her further, "Is that why you put laxatives in the food you gave me?" She downplayed her actions, saying, "It wasn't that much laxative at first, so you were fine. Don't exaggerate, you didn't even need to go to the emergency room." My husband and brother-in-law came to my defense, expressing their anger at her for targeting me. My husband and brother-in-law went as far as declaring that they would disown my mother-in-law. Trembling with fear, she begged them not to go through with it. My father-in-law, who had been semi-conscious throughout our conversation, regained his senses and expressed his disappointment, saying, "You've acted terribly out of sheer ego. The police should have arrested you. I'm so disappointed in you." My mother-in-law panicked and asked, "You're not going to divorce me, are you?" My father-in-law was resolute, insisting that she pay me $30,000 in compensation, but she would have to earn it herself, as he would not assist her in any way. She responded with a worried, "Oh no." My mother-in-law protested, but my husband remained resolute, stating, "Shut up. If you don't agree to these terms, I will divorce you immediately and turn you over to the police." Staring at the prospect of divorce and legal consequences, my mother-in-law had no choice but to comply with the conditions, working diligently to pay me the $30,000 she owed. My father-in-law closely monitored her efforts to ensure she wouldn't cheat. It was clear that she felt overwhelmed by the financial burden, but I believed she deserved this consequence for the pain she had caused me. Meanwhile, my husband and I continued to enjoy a happy life together. My father-in-law and husband assured me that I didn't have to maintain contact with my mother-in-law anymore, which brought me immense relief. Despite the challenges I had faced, I felt secure knowing that with my husband and father-in-law by my side, I could overcome anything. Feeding someone food laced with laxatives is indeed a crime, and it was shocking that a mother-in-law would resort to such actions without hesitation. One might wonder why my father-in-law had married her in the first place. However, it appeared that my husband and his brother were decent individuals, suggesting that perhaps my mother-in-law hadn't always been this way. Regardless, it seemed that her punishment was appropriate, and I hoped she would continue working diligently to repay the $30,000 to me. Above all, I wished for a future filled with happiness and contentment for my husband and me.